Forget what you've seen in those romanticized dramas, where Elizabethan courtiers whisper sweet nothings and sigh over perfumed handkerchiefs. That's absolute, unadulterated bollocks. If you think love in the 16th century was all roses and lutes, you've got another thing coming. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of polite society to reveal the sticky, sweating reality of desire, power, and the frankly bizarre ways humans have always tangled their bodies and fates. And trust me, it's going to be far more visceral than any historical romance could ever dare to show. Let me know what shocked you most, or what delightful historical filth you already knew about. We're all perverts here, right? Imagine, for a moment, being an Elizabethan man, a gallant with a penchant for flowery prose. Your love letters, if you were truly committed to the craft, weren't just about flattering a lady's eyes. Oh no, they were often explicit, crude, and rife with anatomical observations that would make a modern pornographer blush. We're talking about detailed descriptions of bodily reactions, not just emotions. A typical letter might promise to throb with hot desire, or describe how the very thought of a woman made a man's loins ache with lust. This wasn't some coded language. It was blunt. They didn't have the same hang-ups about separating physical arousal from true love that we pretend to have now. Their hearts, and their other organs, were simply part of the same messy package. And the women? They weren't passive recipients of these declarations of throbbing devotion. They often replied in kind, sometimes even more provocatively. A lady might bemoan her own feverish state, or describe how she burned with a secret heat for her admirer. The language was almost medical in its precision, but twisted with a darkly humorous edge. It was a game, certainly, a dance of wit and innuendo, but it was also deeply physically rooted. They were talking about the sweat, the throb, the undeniable presence of the body. There was no pretense of a purely spiritual connection. The flesh was always, explicitly, on the table. It makes you wonder how much actual copulation was going on behind those velvet curtains, doesn't it? Because if the letters were this graphic, what did the actual encounters entail? The stakes, of course, were monstrous. A misplaced word, a rumor of indiscretion, could shatter a reputation, ruin a family, or even lead to public shaming and destitution. Yet they played this dangerous game of erotic brinksmanship with gusto. It wasn't about love, not really. It was about power, about securing a position, about leveraging a body, male or female, for social advancement. A woman's virginity was a commodity, her womb a potential treasury for heirs, and her sexual allure a weapon to be wielded with ruthless precision. And a man's ability to conquer or possess a woman, even symbolically through language, solidified his own masculine standing in a brutal, hierarchical world. This wasn't romance. It was a bloody, high-stakes negotiation disguised as poetry. Disease, too, was a constant, festering presence in this landscape of lust. Syphilis, known as the French pox, was rampant, its gruesome symptoms often openly discussed in contemporary literature. Imagine signing off a love letter with a casual mention of a new boil or a spreading rash. It's a grotesque image, but entirely plausible. Hygiene was primitive, and the stench of unwashed bodies, coupled with the rank odor of disease, must have clung to every encounter. The sweet perfumes they wrote about were often just attempts to mask the underlying filth. So when someone wrote of burning desire, it wasn't always metaphorical. Sometimes, it was a very literal description of the lesions and fevers consuming their bodies. Sound romantic? It wasn't illicit. It was a dangerous, often disgusting gamble, where intimacy could easily become a death sentence. The power words of their era often revolved around the body and its various humors: blood, phlegm, choler, black bile. A love letter might reference how a person's blood heats, or how their liver boils with affection. It was a crude, physiological understanding of emotion, steeped in an almost primal connection to the viscera. They weren't just thinking about feelings. They were thinking about internal organs churning, about fluids secreting, about the raw, undeniable animal urges that propelled them towards one another. And this frankness, this brutal honesty about the body, is what makes their love letters so shocking to our modern, sanitized sensibilities. We've traded explicit bodily functions for vague notions of connection, but perhaps lost something in the process. A recognition of the very real, very messy biology that underpins all desire. The humor, where it existed, was often darkly cynical. A sarcastic quip about a failed seduction, or a biting remark about a rival's lack of virility, or a woman's frigidity, could easily find its way into correspondence. It wasn't about delicate sensibilities, it was about blunt assessment, about power plays and dominance. The witty exchanges in plays like Shakespeare's were often thinly veiled insults, designed to expose weaknesses or mock pretension. And this extended to their private communications, where a casual, dismissive tone could be just as devastating as outright condemnation. The ability to wield language, especially explicit and provocative language, was a mark of status, a sign of one's mastery over the crude realities of existence. So next time you romanticize the Elizabethan era, remember this. Their love was a complex, dirty, and utterly captivating spectacle of human nature. It was a constant negotiation of social standing, a dangerous game of sexual brinkmanship, and a raw, unflinching acknowledgement of the body's demands. It was grotesque, certainly, but it was also profoundly human, a testament to the enduring, brutal power of lust, and the lengths people will go to acquire it, possess it, or simply survive its relentless throb. Their letters weren't just words, they were smears of desire, blood, and a desperate, crawling need to transcend the filth of their existence through the fleeting intimacy of another sweating body. Now, let's cast our cynical gaze further back, to imperial Rome, a civilization we often picture as a bastion of marble busts and stoic senators. Forget the elegant toga parties you've seen in Hollywood epics. The Roman elite, particularly during the Republic's decline and the Empire's zenith, didn't just indulge in orgies, they weaponized them. Sex was a currency, a public spectacle of dominance, and a brutal tool for political maneuvering. When they gathered for banquets, the vomitoriums weren't just for purging excess food. They were part of a ritual of gluttony that extended to every bodily function, including sexual ones. The rank odor of ambition mixed freely with the stench of regurgitated wine and the sweat of forced revelry. Emperors like Caligula, Nero, and Messalina didn't just have private affairs. They turned their bedrooms into political battlegrounds and public stages. Caligula, for instance, was rumored to have publicly prostituted his own sisters and forced senators to witness or participate in his debaucheries, transforming consensual sex into a humiliating exhibition of his absolute power. This wasn't about pleasure in any conventional sense. It was about stripping away dignity, about forcing submission, about demonstrating that every body, no matter how noble, was ultimately subject to the emperor's vile whim. The moans heard in the palace weren't always those of ecstasy. Often, they were cries of silent despair, choked back by the sheer terror of imperial madness. Messalina, Emperor Claudius's wife, was notorious not just for her numerous lovers, but for her alleged public contests with prostitutes to see who could service the most men in a single night. Whether historical fact or lurid propaganda, the story itself reveals a society where female sexuality, especially imperial female sexuality, was either rigidly controlled or explosively, scandalously public. Her excesses, real or imagined, served to highlight the moral decay of the ruling class, where personal lust became a direct challenge to the very fabric of Roman society. Her body, in the public imagination, was a site of uncontrolled, dangerous desire, an oozing symbol of imperial corruption. Slaves, of course, were at the bottom of this fleshy hierarchy. Their bodies were simply tools, commodities to be bought, sold, and used without consent. A Roman master could do whatever he wished with his slaves, and this included forced sexual acts, which were not considered rape under Roman law. Imagine the constant threat, the pervasive fear, the utter lack of agency. Their lives were a perpetual state of vulnerability, their bodies existing solely for the gratification or utility of their owners. The silence of these victims is perhaps the most horrifying detail. Their shame was absolute, their public exposure inevitable, their survival often dependent on their quiet endurance of unimaginable degradation. Even the architecture of Roman baths and villas facilitated this promiscuous environment. Private rooms and secluded alcoves existed alongside large communal areas, creating a space where public display and private assignation could blend seamlessly. The air would have been thick with the scent of oils, perfumes, and the inescapable odor of unwashed bodies mingled with sweat and something far more primal. It was a sensory overload, designed to overwhelm and disorient, to strip away individual inhibitions and merge them into a collective tide of indulgence. The lust wasn't hidden, it crawled openly through the mosaics and along the marble floors. The philosophical elites, meanwhile, often viewed these excesses with a detached cynicism. Seneca, for example, might write scathing condemnations of Roman debauchery, yet still navigate the treacherous waters of the imperial court. Their intellectual disdain did little to stem the tide of overt sensuality. If anything, it highlighted the hypocrisy. They understood that the power games were played not just with legions and laws, but with bodies and appetites. The ability to indulge, to flaunt one's vices, was a perverse sign of status, a demonstration that one was above the petty concerns of morality. So, when we look back at Rome, we shouldn't just see the grandeur. We should also acknowledge the underlying, festering reality of its sexual landscape. It was a place where power was exercised through the brutalization of bodies, where lust was a political weapon, and where even the most sacred figures could engage in acts of public depravity that defied modern comprehension. Their decadence wasn't just harmless indulgence. It was a deliberate, vile demonstration of absolute power over the flesh. All of it. The empire might have built roads and aqueducts, but it also constructed an elaborate, grotesque system of sexual control and exploitation, a legacy of shame that continues to throb in the darker corners of our historical consciousness. And the blood that flowed wasn't just from gladiators, it was from a society bleeding out from its own unchecked desires. Moving from Rome's imperial decay to the medieval period, we often conjure images of knights, castles, and an almost puritanical piety. The myth of the medieval chastity belt, a cruel device supposedly locked onto women by crusading husbands, persists in our pop culture. But here's the brutal truth. The ubiquitous iron chastity belt was largely a Victorian fantasy, a grotesque invention of later centuries projected onto a dark age to highlight their own perceived enlightenment. The real chains on medieval women were far more insidious, invisible, and utterly pervasive. They were forged from religious fear, patriarchal control, and the constant, choking threat of public shaming. Medieval society's obsession with female purity was absolute, driven by a church that viewed women as inherently sinful, the descendants of Eve, temptresses whose bodies were gateways to damnation. Virginity was not just a virtue, it was a commodity, vital for securing a proper marriage and ensuring legitimate heirs. A woman's honor was not her own, it was her family's, tied directly to the inviolability of her hymen. Imagine the pressure, the constant scrutiny, the terrifying prospect of a premarital slip which could consign her to a life of destitution or worse. The concept of hymenal inspection was a very real, very public form of control, often carried out by older women or even midwives, a degrading ritual designed to ensure compliance. Should a woman be suspected of unchastity, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Public shaming was common. She might be paraded through the streets, mocked, or even subjected to physical humiliation. Her reputation, her very identity, would be smeared with filth. Her marriage prospects would evaporate, and her family would bear the brunt of the shame. This wasn't just social ostracization. It was a form of civic death, a brutal lesson in the absolute power of societal norms over individual autonomy. Her vulnerability was absolute, her body always under potential assault, either by a rapist or by the judgmental gaze of an entire community. The constant threat of accusation was a pervasive anxiety, particularly for those outside the protective bubble of noble families. For peasant women, their lives were a precarious balance between survival and the constant threat of exploitation. A lord might exercise his droit du seigneur, the supposed right to sleep with a newly married bride, though this practice is heavily debated by historians. Regardless of its frequency, the belief in such a right, the underlying power dynamic it represented, cast a dark shadow over countless lives. It was another way the female body was reduced to a site of potential use and inevitable punishment, a landscape for men's desires and demands. And then, of course, there were the witch hunts, which reached their chilling zenith in the late medieval and early modern periods. The accusations were often deeply sexualized, revolving around alleged nightly congress with the devil, or unnatural acts performed to harm others. Women suspected of witchcraft were subjected to invasive body searches for devil's marks, which could be any mole, scar, or physical anomaly. They were stripped, prodded, and publicly exposed, their bodies becoming a canvas for the projection of societal fears and sexual anxieties. The torture, when it came, was designed not just to extract confessions, but to break the spirit, to force compliance, to witness the ultimate humiliation. The silence forced upon these women was deafening. To speak out against a powerful lord, against a judgmental priest, or against the accusations of a frenzied mob, was to invite further degradation or death. Their survival often depended on their ability to internalize the shame, to carry the burden of their perceived sins, or to simply disappear into the margins of society. There were no hero arcs here, just cycles of oppression and bitter survival, where the human spirit was relentlessly ground down by the weight of religious dogma and patriarchal control. So, while the image of the iron chastity belt might be an exaggerated fiction, the underlying reality it symbolizes was terrifyingly real. The actual chains weren't iron contraptions. They were the invisible ones of shame and terror, bolted directly to a woman's reproductive organs by the church and state. They were the constant whispers, the watchful eyes, the fear of public exposure, the looming threat of the pyre. Medieval society didn't need physical devices to control female sexuality. It had something far more potent, a pervasive, brutal ideology that sought to subjugate, silence, and punish any deviation from its rigid, fear-driven norms. The female body was a constant site of conflict, a battleground where purity was demanded and impurity was ruthlessly expunged, leaving behind a trail of physical and emotional scars that throbbed through generations. Moving forward in time, the Victorian era often conjures images of buttoned-up prudishness, crinolines, and an almost absurd level of modesty. We imagine a society where sex was never spoken of, only hinted at, preferably in hushed tones, far behind closed doors. But that's a carefully constructed myth, a veneer over a festering core of sexual anxiety, hypocrisy, and frankly, grotesque exploitation. Victorians weren't prudes. They were repressed. And that repression manifested in truly bizarre, often cruel, and utterly cynical ways. Take, for instance, the epidemic of female hysteria. If a woman exhibited any emotion beyond demure obedience, anxiety, irritability, sexual desire, even boredom, she was likely diagnosed with hysteria, a nebulous condition believed to originate in a wandering uterus. And the common cure? A pelvic massage performed by a male physician, often culminating in the patient's paroxysmal convulsion, a euphemism for orgasm. This wasn't some back-alley abortionist. These were respected doctors, performing what was essentially medically sanctioned masturbation, all while maintaining a facade of scientific objectivity. The sheer erotic irony is suffocating. A society that publicly demonized female sexual pleasure was privately inducing it for health purposes, treating women's bodies like malfunctioning machines that simply needed a good jolt. The shame, the public exposure, the intimate as control dynamic was staggering. Corsets, those instruments of torture designed to mold the female body into an impossible hourglass, were another symptom of this twisted sexual control. They compressed organs, restricted breathing, and were worn so tightly they could cause internal damage. Why? To achieve an aesthetic of fragile femininity, to emphasize a tiny waist and an exaggerated bosom and derriere. It was a visual language of sexual provocation and simultaneously physical constriction. The woman was to be alluring, yes, but also contained, literally bound by her clothing. Her body was a spectacle, an object of desire, but only within the very narrow, suffocating confines society deemed acceptable. To be loose was to be a moral abomination. To be cinched beyond belief was the height of propriety. Beyond the drawing rooms, the streets seethed with unspoken sexual realities. Prostitution was rampant, a massive underground economy thriving despite constant moral condemnation. Thousands of women, often driven by desperate poverty, sold their bodies, becoming carriers of the era's most pervasive and gruesome secret, venereal disease. Syphilis and gonorrhea spread like wildfire, silently contaminating families, destroying lives, and perpetuating a cycle of shame and suffering. The Victorian gentleman, who publicly condemned vice, might privately visit a brothel, then return home to his pure wife, unknowingly infecting her with a creeping, agonizing illness. The filth wasn't just moral, it was biological, a silent, oozing epidemic beneath the polished surface of society. Children, too, were not spared from this grim reality. Child prostitution, though hidden in the darkest corners, was a horrifying stain on Victorian morality. The exploitation of young, vulnerable bodies speaks volumes about the society's true values, about the absolute power of the wealthy and the utterly disposable nature of the poor. The cries of these victims were largely ignored, their suffering dismissed or actively covered up by a system that preferred to maintain its illusion of decency at all costs. The rank stench of hypocrisy was overwhelming. The prevailing attitude towards female sexuality was one of fear and suppression. Women were supposed to be passionless, pure, and angelic, unless, of course, they were the fallen women, the prostitutes, the insane. Any deviation from this narrow path was met with severe social censure, institutionalization, or outright abandonment. The power dynamics were stark. Men held almost absolute control over women's bodies and destinies. A husband could commit his wife to an asylum for exhibiting unruly behavior, which often simply meant she dared to assert her own will or express her own desires. Their carefully constructed facade of decency was a rotten shell, hiding a festering core of sexual anxiety and grotesque exploitation, where women's bodies were both worshipped and brutally dissected. The Victorians, for all their outward piety, were a society riddled with contradictions, their sexual repression boiling over into bizarre medical practices, widespread prostitution, and a pervasive, insidious form of control. They built magnificent empires, but they also built a prison of shame and silence around human desire, a throb of suppressed lust and fear that, despite their best efforts, perpetually threatened to burst forth in a horrifying, undeniable smear. The silence was deafening, but the underlying torment was loud and clear. Travel now to ancient Egypt, a civilization known for its majestic pyramids and intricate hieroglyphs. We often view their gods as serene, otherworldly beings, removed from the squalid realities of human existence. But that's a sanitized, modern perspective. In ancient Egypt, life and death were deeply intertwined with brutal, explicit fertility rituals, often involving the pharaoh's very potent or very symbolic seed. Their deities were not just abstract concepts, they were intimately connected to the earth's cycles, to the Nile's inundation, and to the raw, visceral act of creation. And that meant sex, in its most fundamental, often disturbing forms, was divine. Consider the myth of Osiris. He was brutally murdered and dismembered by his brother Set, his body parts scattered. But his wife, Isis, magically reassembled him, famously fashioning a golden phallus for him when the original was swallowed by a fish. She then conceived their son, Horus, through this resurrected, reconstructed deity. This isn't some quaint bedtime story. It's a foundational myth about divine resurrection, creation, and the absolute necessity of the male generative principle. It speaks to a deep cultural preoccupation with potency, with the power of the phallus to bring forth life, even from death. It's anatomically precise, with a darkly humorous edge that we rarely acknowledge. Public masturbation by high priests was not just tolerated, it was a revered religious ritual. During festivals dedicated to the Nile's inundation, priests would sometimes engage in ritualistic autoerotic acts, symbolically ejaculating into the river or onto the fields to ensure a bountiful harvest. The idea was that the divine seed, replicating the life-giving flow of the Nile, would fertilize the earth and bring forth abundance. Imagine standing in the desert heat, watching a priest publicly perform for the benefit of the harvest. It's a jarring image, a blending of the sacred and the profane, of bodily fluids and spiritual well-being. The throb of life was literally projected onto the landscape, a raw, primal prayer. The pharaoh himself was considered a living god, the embodiment of Horus, and his potency was directly linked to the prosperity of Egypt. His divine erections were not just personal biological functions. They were seen as manifestations of cosmic order. Ensuring the royal lineage, producing male heirs, was paramount, a matter of national security and divine mandate. The pharaoh's virility was a public affair, a constant source of anxiety and celebration. The sheer burden of this expectation, the constant pressure to perform, both literally and symbolically, must have been immense. His body was not his own. It belonged to the state, to the gods, to the river, to the very cycle of life and death that sustained the kingdom. Egyptian art, too, is full of explicit sexual imagery, often depicting gods and goddesses engaged in carnal acts, or human figures with exaggerated sexual characteristics. These weren't hidden away in private chambers. They were part of public temples and tomb decorations, open for all to see. The Egyptians were not squeamish about the body, its functions, or its desires. Their depictions of the animal world, too, often included crude, frank portrayals of mating and procreation, reinforcing the idea that sex was a natural, inescapable part of the cosmic order. The lust was everywhere, crawling over every surface, embedded in every prayer. The crude realities of sex in a desert climate, the sweat, the dust, the challenges of hygiene, were simply part of the fabric of life. Unlike some later civilizations, the Egyptians didn't seem to obsess over filth in the same moralistic way, but rather accepted the bodily functions as natural. Their understanding of the human body was practical, almost mechanical, and they sought to understand its workings, both in life and death, with an almost chilling detachment. This included, of course, the intricate process of mummification, a grotesque but necessary act of preserving the body for its afterlife, a testament to their belief in the enduring nature of the physical form, even after it ceased to throb with life. The divine was disturbingly carnal, a messy affair of semen, mud, and endless cycles of rebirth, where the ruler's potency dictated the nation's survival, leaving little room for personal desire, just a throbbing, collective need. Ancient Egypt wasn't just about grand monuments and intricate rituals. It was about a profound, raw connection to the body, its fluids, and its capacity for creation. The pharaoh's very breath, his very throb, was interwoven with the fate of the land, and the collective desire for life and prosperity was expressed in the most explicit, unvarnished terms possible. It was a civilization built on the fertile mud of the Nile, and the fertile, sweating bodies of its people, a constant cycle of lust, creation, and the inevitability of the grave. Now, let's step into the perfumed, treacherous world of the Renaissance, an era celebrated for its artistic brilliance and intellectual rebirth. We hear about courtly love, idealized romance, knights writing sonnets to unattainable ladies, a delicate dance of adoration and poetic yearning. Forget all that saccharine nonsense. Beneath the veneer of chivalry and eloquent declarations lay a brutal battleground of alliances, forced marriages, sexual coercion, and the public degradation of women whose honor was merely a tool for men's advancement. It was a vicious game of power, and sex was the most potent, most dangerous weapon in the arsenal. Arranged marriages were the norm, especially among the nobility. Love had little to do with it. These were meticulously calculated transactions of land, wealth, and political influence. A daughter was a commodity, her body a vessel for heirs, her virginity a crucial asset to be traded. Imagine being a young noblewoman, perhaps 14 or 15, sold off to a man you barely knew, often much older, whose primary interest was your dowry and your womb. Your desire, your personal feelings, were utterly irrelevant. Your purpose was to produce male heirs, to secure the family line, and to endure whatever indignities your new husband might inflict. The pressure to conceive was immense, a constant anxiety that throbbed beneath the surface of every happy union. But human desire, being the stubborn, filthy thing it is, couldn't be entirely suppressed. Secret liaisons and adulterous affairs were rampant, particularly in the sprawling, sexually charged courts. The stakes, however, were astronomically high. Discovery could lead to ruin. A woman might be disowned, sent to a convent, or even publicly shamed and humiliated. A man could face imprisonment, loss of status, or even assassination. The constant threat of syphilis, a gruesome, disfiguring disease, added another layer of visceral horror to these illicit encounters. A moment of illicit pleasure could lead to a lifetime of rotting flesh, a constant reminder of sin etched into the very body. The blood and ooze of the disease was a testament to the dangers of transgression. Public shaming for loose women was a spectacle of cruelty. If a woman of noble birth was deemed unfaithful, she might be forced to confess her sins publicly, her reputation smeared, her family name dragged through the mud. For women of lower status, the punishment could be even more brutal. Public flogging, forced hair, cutting, or being paraded through the streets in a humiliating manner. Their bodies were exposed, their shame broadcast to the entire community, a chilling warning to others who might dare to transgress. This was not about justice. It was about social control, about reinforcing rigid patriarchal norms through terror and degradation. The absolute power of husbands was legally enshrined. A wife was essentially her husband's property, her body and her labor, his to command. He could beat her, imprison her, or force her to comply with his sexual demands, all within the bounds of the law. There was little recourse for abused women, their voices often silenced, their suffering dismissed as a private matter. The emotional triggers of shame, public exposure, and exploitation were daily realities for countless women, their intimacy constantly leveraged as a form of control, their survival dependent on their silent endurance. Courtly love, then, was often a cynical performance, a rhetorical exercise divorced from the messy reality of power, lust, and brutal pragmatism. It was a way for men to hone their poetic skills, to engage in intellectual flirtation, while simultaneously pursuing their own sexual conquests and political ambitions. The women celebrated in verse were often unattainable precisely because they were already married, making the pursuit a safe, symbolic one, free from the messy consequences of actual consummation, unless, of course, the game turned deadly serious. Courtly love? More like courtly lust and calculated cruelty, where a woman's body was a negotiable asset, her desire irrelevant, and her potential shame a constant, choking threat. The Renaissance wasn't just about beauty and rebirth. It was about the raw, visceral reality of human power dynamics, where the body was constantly leveraged, controlled, and often brutalized. The romantic notions were a thin veil over a landscape of forced marriages, rampant disease, and the constant threat of public humiliation. It was a bleak reflection of human nature, where the cycles of lust and punishment continued to throb, leaving countless lives shattered in their wake, their cries silenced by the suffocating weight of social convention. Journey now to the elaborate, often cruel confines of ancient Asian imperial courts, specifically focusing on systems of concubinage and the ubiquitous presence of eunuchs. Forget the romanticized notions of lavish harems filled with sensual delights and harmonious women. This was not some pampered paradise. It was a gilded cage, a brutal battleground of thousands of women vying for a moment of imperial attention, their lives defined by the emperor's whim and the watchful, often menacing, eyes of castrated men. Concubinage was a widespread practice across many Asian dynasties, from China to the Ottoman Empire. Emperors, kings, and powerful lords maintained vast harems filled with women of varying ranks, wives, concubines, palace ladies, all existing in a strict hierarchy. A woman's entire existence revolved around the possibility of attracting the emperor's favor, enduring his sexual advances, and most importantly, producing a male heir. Failure to do so meant a life of obscurity, poverty, or worse. The daily power struggles within these confines were intense, a constant psychological torment where alliances shifted like desert sands and betrayal lurked behind every painted screen. Imagine living your entire life in a suffocating competition, where your worth was determined solely by your ability to produce a specific biological outcome, all while being surveilled by those who had been literally defanged. The eunuchs, those tragically altered figures, were the true masters of these inner courts, Castrated as boys, they were deemed safe to guard the women, as they supposedly lacked sexual desire. But this power vacuum often turned them into formidable, often cruel figures. They controlled access to the emperor, managed the daily lives of the thousands of women, and wielded immense informal power through their proximity to the throne. Their physical emasculation, often performed in a brutal, unsanitary fashion, granted them an ironic, perverse authority over the most intimate aspects of imperial life. Their very existence was a stark reminder of the brutal power dynamics at play, a constant, sickening throb in the heart of the imperial system. The competition for the emperor's attention was a desperate game. Women would employ elaborate beauty rituals, cunning intrigues, and even poison to gain an edge. A single night with the emperor could elevate a concubine's status, but it could also make her a target for the jealousy of rivals. The ultimate goal was to bear a son, as only a male heir could secure a concubine's future and elevate her status. If a concubine bore a daughter, or worse, failed to conceive, her life could become a living hell, filled with neglect, deprivation, or even infanticide, particularly if the child was deemed an inconvenience or a threat. The casual references to abuse, hierarchy, and religious hypocrisy were everywhere. The psychological toll on these women was immense. Confined to gilded cages, often separated from their families and stripped of their individual identities, their lives were a monotonous cycle of waiting, hoping, and fearing. Their sexual lives were not their own. They were dictated by the emperor's whim, devoid of intimacy or personal connection. Intimacy was control, sex a duty, and pleasure often an irrelevant byproduct. The silence surrounding their personal desires, their emotional needs, was absolute. Their only hope for survival, for even a flicker of personal power, lay in mastering the intricate rules of the imperial game, often at the cost of their own humanity. And what about the emperor himself? He was the apex of this system, but also a prisoner of it. Expected to maintain a vast harem, to produce countless heirs, and to uphold the image of divine virility, his sexual life was rarely a matter of personal choice. It was a duty, a public performance, a constant demonstration of his power and fertility. He might have thousands of women at his disposal, but true intimacy was likely elusive, replaced by a constant parade of bodies and a cynical manipulation of lust and desire. Imagine an entire life spent waiting to be chosen, or discarded, by a man who owned your very breath, while eunuchs, those tragically altered figures, stalked the perfumed corridors, enforcing a system built on perpetual sexual anxiety and the crushing weight of royal indifference. The filth was everywhere, in the forced smiles, the whispered conspiracies, the silent tears. The ultimate resolution for most of these women was often emotional or physical humiliation, or simply bitter survival within a system that relentlessly exploited their bodies and extinguished their spirits. It was a vast, sprawling theater of sexual horror, where the human heart was reduced to a commodity, its throb a mere echo in the grand, terrifying machinery of imperial power. Now, let's descend into the truly unsettling realm of pre-Columbian civilizations, specifically focusing on the Aztecs and Mayans, challenging the sanitized notions that often reduce them to peaceful spiritualists or abstract astronomers. Their reverence for life and death wasn't gentle or abstract. It was a visceral, bloody affair, where the body's fluids, blood, semen, sweat were potent offerings, a constant, raw testament to the thin veil between ecstatic worship and the final, gruesome choke. Sex, sacrifice, and the macabre were often inextricably intertwined in their religious and social fabric, often with shocking brutality. Take the Aztec practice of human sacrifice, for instance. We often focus on the heart-ripping, which was, indeed, a central element. But the rituals were far more complex, and often involved an intimate connection to fertility and the body. Sacrificial victims were not just anonymous offerings. They were often seen as embodying deities, especially those related to agriculture and life cycles. Their blood, profusely shed, was believed to nourish the earth and ensure the sun's daily rebirth. The very act of killing was a creation, a grotesque comedy of life through death, where the ultimate humiliation of the victim was transformed into a profound spiritual act. The fear and blood were palpable. Beyond the public spectacles, ritualistic bloodletting was common among the elite, both male and female, in Maya and Aztec societies. This wasn't just a symbolic prick. It often involved piercing the tongue, ears, or even the genitals with thorns, obsidian blades, or stingray spines. The blood was then collected on bark paper and burned, the smoke rising as an offering to the gods. Imagine the excruciating pain, the deliberate self-mutilation for religious purposes. The sexual horror of a noble engaging in genital bloodletting is stark. It's a testament to the extreme lengths they would go to communicate with the divine, to nourish the cosmos with their own vital fluids, their own raw essence. Their bodies were not their own. They were instruments of divine appeasement. Their moans of pain, a form of prayer. The symbolism of fertility was rampant, often depicted through explicit sexual iconography. Aztec earth goddesses like Tlazolteotl were associated with filth, purification, and carnal desire, often shown in positions that overtly suggested sexual acts or giving birth. She was both the eater of filth, symbolically human sin, and a patron of illicit desires. This complex figure embodies the Aztec acceptance of the messy, sometimes disgusting, reality of human nature, where sin and sexuality were inextricably linked, yet also capable of purification. It's anatomical comedy taken to a spiritual level, where the very act of excretion or sexual release could be a pathway to divine understanding. For the Mayans, their pantheon included deities associated with sexual transgression and disease. Patrons of prostitutes, for example, highlighted the practical realities of a society that, while having strict moral codes, also acknowledged the existence of sexual commerce. The prevalence of venereal disease, evidenced by skeletal remains showing signs of syphilis, further underscored the crude realities of their sexual lives, a silent, creeping shame that spread through the populace. Their rich artistic tradition, often depicting gruesome scenes of sacrifice and self-mutilation, also included figures engaged in overtly sexual acts, demonstrating a more open, though complex, relationship with carnal desires than many modern cultures. The cyclical nature of their worldview, creation, destruction, rebirth, was deeply embedded in their sexual and sacrificial practices. The body was seen as temporary, a vessel for the soul, and its fluids were a vital link to the cosmos. The act of shedding blood, whether in sacrifice or ritualistic bloodletting, was a mirror of creation, a way of giving life back to the gods who had bestowed it. It was a bleak reflection on existence, where individual suffering was subsumed into a grand cosmic purpose, a chilling reminder that human lives and human bodies were ultimately expendable in the face of divine demands. Their reverence for life and death wasn't gentle or abstract. It was a visceral, bloody affair, where the body's fluids, blood, semen, sweat, were potent offerings, a constant, raw testament to the thin veil between ecstatic worship and the final, gruesome choke. The Aztecs and Mayans didn't shy away from the grotesque, the painful, or the explicitly sexual. They embraced it as part of the divine order, integrating lust, power, and punishment into a worldview that was both awe-inspiring and utterly terrifying. Their stories are a chilling reminder that piety can manifest in truly horrifying ways, and that the human body, in its most vulnerable and expressive forms, has always been the ultimate canvas for our most profound and most disturbing beliefs. The sheer scale of their practices, the overwhelming sensory overload, the absolute belief in the efficacy of such horror, leaves you with a deep, unsettling throb. Let's drag ourselves out of the ancient jungles and into the simmering cauldron of early modern Europe, where the witch trials ignited a terrifying, sexually charged purge of societal anxieties. Forget the simple image of cackling old women on broomsticks. The chilling reality of witch trials was a brutal, often profoundly misogynistic campaign fueled by religious dogma, mass hysteria, and a pervasive, insidious sexual paranoia. It was a carnival of terror, where the female body became the ultimate battleground, a site of public exposure, torture, and degradation. The accusations themselves were frequently deeply sexualized. Accused witches were often alleged to have engaged in direct, carnal intercourse with the devil or with demonic familiars. These were not metaphorical acts. They were believed to be physical, often perverse encounters, detailed in horrific confessions extracted under torture. Imagine being forced to describe, under immense duress, how you lay with the black man, or engaged in unnatural acts with an imp that licked your private parts. The questions posed by interrogators were often shockingly explicit, designed to humiliate and break the accused, linking perceived heresy directly to sexual deviance. The power reversal scenes were constant, the accusers twisting the narratives with grotesque, erotic irony. A key part of the witch trial process involved the invasive devil's mark examinations. Accused women, and sometimes men, but predominantly women, were stripped naked, their entire bodies meticulously searched for any unusual blemish, a mole, a scar, a birthmark, even hemorrhoids, which could be interpreted as a pact mark, where the devil had sucked their blood. These examinations were often performed by prickers, who would deliberately pierce the mark with needles to see if it bled or caused pain, often leading to agonizing torture for the accused. This was public stripping, systematic degradation, and an egregious violation of bodily autonomy, all under the guise of religious righteousness. The shame, the public exposure, the sheer filth of it was inescapable. The role of perceived sexual deviance in these accusations cannot be overstated. Old, unmarried women, widows, and those who deviated from societal norms in any way were particularly vulnerable. Their lack of male protection, their perceived sexual independence, or lack thereof, made them easy targets for the projection of societal anxieties about female sexuality. Any woman who is too beautiful, too ugly, too outspoken, or simply too different could find herself accused. Her body, her sexuality, became a weapon to be turned against her, a sign of her alleged allegiance to the demonic. The vulnerability was raw and constant, the terror a chilling, pervasive throb. The physical torture designed to elicit confessions was horrific, often explicitly targeting the body's most vulnerable points. Sleep deprivation, forced standing, starvation, thumb screws, the rack, all designed to break the will and compel confessions of unnatural acts. Under such duress, individuals would confess to impossible crimes, including flying on broomsticks, transforming into animals, or having intercourse with the devil, simply to make the pain stop. The confessions were not about truth. They were about narrative control, about creating a story that justified the horrific violence being inflicted. The raw, guttural moans of the tormented filled the chambers, a chorus of despair. The terror wasn't just fear of magic. It was the raw, primal fear of female sexuality, deemed inherently sinful and dangerous, twisted into a grotesque carnival of torture and public exposure, where every woman was a potential suspect, her body a battlefield of suspicion. The witch trials were, at their core, a vast, systematic attempt to control and punish women, to extinguish any perceived deviation from the narrow path of piety and submission. The resolution for most was either death at the stake or gallows, or a shattered, publicly shamed existence marked forever by the accusations. There was no hero arc here, only exploitation, humiliation, and bitter survival through silence. The grotesque escalation, the sensory overload of fear and pain, the sexual horror were central to the witch hunt experience. It was a myth-puncturing reality, revealing that true horror often lies not in supernatural monsters, but in the depths of human paranoia and cruelty. The blood, the sweat, the fear, the shame, all smeared across the pages of history, a bleak reflection on how easily collective anxiety can devolve into systematic torture, how quickly the human body can become a public spectacle of control, and how endlessly the cycle of lust, power, and punishment continues to throb beneath the surface of civilization. So, after this charming historical tour of human depravity, you might be tempted to pat yourselves on the back and declare, "We've come so far. We have smartphones, gender equality movements, and apparently, a more enlightened understanding of sexuality." But don't break out the celebratory champagne just yet. Despite our technological advances and supposed social progress, the core patterns of sexual exploitation, power imbalance, and the commodification of bodies persist. They haven't vanished. They've simply transmuted into new, often more insidious forms. The filth just changes its packaging. Consider the pervasive, insidious nature of modern sex trafficking. It's not medieval arranged marriages or Roman slave markets, but the brutal reality of human beings bought, sold, and forced into sexual servitude thrives globally. The victims, predominantly women and children, are stripped of their agency, their bodies treated as disposable commodities, their lives reduced to a constant state of fear and physical degradation. The psychological torment, the shame, the physical violence are direct descendants of historical practices, merely updated for the 21st century. The emotional triggers of exploitation, public exposure, and intimacy, as control, remain horrifyingly potent. The moans are often silent, the blood hidden. Then there's the internet, our great global connector, which has also become a vast, unregulated marketplace for sexual exploitation. Child sexual abuse material, revenge porn, online prostitution rings. These are not isolated incidents. They are sprawling, deeply disturbing industries that thrive in the dark corners of the digital world. The anonymity of the internet allows perpetrators to operate with chilling impunity, while victims face permanent digital scars, their most intimate moments broadcast for public consumption, their lives irrevocably shattered. The public exposure is no longer a town square. It's a global network, infinitely more pervasive, infinitely more humiliating. The sense of shame and utter powerlessness is absolute. The persistent shame culture around female bodies, while perhaps less overt than in Victorian times, still exerts a powerful grip. Women are still slut-shamed for expressing their sexuality, still judged more harshly for perceived promiscuity, still expected to navigate a minefield of contradictory expectations. The purity culture movements, whether religious or secular, continue to enforce a narrow, often misogynistic view of female sexuality, perpetuating cycles of guilt and self-hatred. The language might be softer, the punishment less physical, but the underlying message of control and judgment remains a constant nagging throb. And the power dynamics? They haven't disappeared. Sexual harassment and assault remain rampant in workplaces, academic institutions, and even within families. The abuse of power, often cloaked in professional respectability, allows individuals to exploit others sexually, leveraging their position, their wealth, or their influence. The victims often face immense pressure to remain silent, fearing career ruin, social ostracization, or further retaliation. The conflict is still status-based, the resolution often humiliation or bitter survival, forcing victims to endure their pain in silence, their voices choked by fear. Don't pat yourselves on the back too hard. We might have different toys, different platforms, but the fundamental, squalid mechanics of human lust and control remain grimly consistent. A silent, sickening throb beneath the veneer of progress. The filth just changes its packaging. The same desires, the same insecurities, the same hunger for dominance continue to drive human behavior, merely manifesting in new forms. We might think we're so much more enlightened, but look closely, and you'll see the same patterns of shame, public exposure, and exploitation playing out daily. A stark reminder that history isn't just a collection of dusty old stories. It's a living, breathing, festering wound that continues to bleed into our present, a brutal testament to the enduring cycles of lust, power, and punishment that define the human condition. The grotesque past isn't past. It's simply taken a new, more technologically advanced form, but it crawls on just the same.